Once a proud monument to communist ambitions, now the plant is a dinosaur, poisoning a town that has no future without it. Magnitogorsk was built from nothing, 1,000 miles east of Moscow on a barren steppe in the Ural Mountains. On Stalin's orders, hundreds labored and died to build a steelworks on this rich seam of iron ore. It was a feat of mass heroism, proof the workers' will could overcome the obstacles of nature. But pride in the past is today overshadowed by anxiety about the town's future. The Kombinat, as the steel plant is known, produced the metal for every second tank and every third shell used by Russia in World War II. Today, this one plant produces 10% of Soviet steel, 160 million tons a year. But the technology's hardly changed since the war. The steel's no longer of a high enough quality for weapons. It's used for car bodies and basic nuts and bolts. And the obsolete open hearth system produces 865,000 tons of air pollutants every year. The filtration system is almost non-existent. In producing this steel, the Kombinat's chimneys poison the air with 9 times the legal limit of benzene, 5 times the legal limit of sulfur compounds. Last year, the local newspaper, the Magnitogorsk Worker, shocked its readers by publishing statistics on air pollution and the increase in disease. Glastnost was forced on this conservative town by a group of young journalists. As with Chernobyl and the Aral, the newly emboldened media played a decisive role in arousing public awareness of environmental dangers.
Our paper has chosen to speak the truth. It was very difficult to start with. When we published complete statistics about the ecological situation in our town, it had a bombshell effect. Now we and the whole town have the problem of what to do with this information. How can we live with the facts which have been revealed?
The paper confirmed what doctors knew already but had been afraid to say openly. The hospital's cancer wards are overflowing, despite the extra beds they've squeezed in. Many of the patients we saw had worked for the Kombinat. Lung cancer rates have doubled in Magnitogorsk in the last decade. The majority of children have chronic bronchial diseases. Stillbirths are a third higher in the town than in the area around.
The extremely high incidence of lung cancer and other chest diseases is the result of pollutants produced by the Kombinat. For a long time, our system has talked about caring for the health of people, but it hasn't done anything. There was a need for metal, above all metal, and people haven't been taken care of.
Magnitogorsk is a company town. All streets lead to the steelworks. The Lenin Metallurgical Kombinat dominates the city. The livelihood of virtually every family depends on this industry. Of a total population of 450,000 men, women and children, 63,000 people work for the Kombinat. Magnitogorsk can ill afford pollution control. The plant is obsolescent, and the seam of iron ore that gave birth to the town has been exhausted. Every day, 700 wagon loads of ore have to be brought in from up to 1,500 miles away. Magnitogorsk can only operate because the state pays for transport and raw materials. One new converter workshop is being built. It's a cleaner way of making steel. But this one modern facility will only reduce pollution overall by 20%. Local scientists recommended a more radical solution. It required more investment, though it could have produced cheaper steel in the long term. But the ministry decided on the converter, which many believe is no solution.
The economic problem is that the new equipment we're installing is 10 or even 50 times as expensive as the current plant. And reconstructing the manufacturing process as such doesn't bring in any profit. It only becomes profitable when the steel is turned into actual products. We won't be doing that until the second stage of our reconstruction. In fact, the converter will reduce our economic efficiency for the first year.
Vladimir Kulpin has worked for the Kombinat since he left school. So did his father and his wife's father too. This generation is aware of the dangers of pollution in a way their parents never were, but they also know there's a trade-off between the cost of cleaner air and economic performance. Vladimir's job provides security and a reasonable salary by Soviet standards. Modernizing the plant would improve the town's health, but it could also reduce employment. That would hit every family. Magnitogorsk represents Perestroika's dilemma.
When my husband left school, he trained to be a steel worker. And I suppose he's not at the age when he can change to something else. His work is hard, and the air he breathes isn't good, but we try to make sure he rests and goes fishing when he has a day off.
The workers know about the air pollution caused by the combinat, but we aren't working for some ideal, but for money. And so we have to carry on. There's a central plan and orders to be fulfilled. After all, we've got to live. We know the dangers, but we have to work.
Vladimir Kulpin and the other workers can't believe there's little future for Magnitogorsk. They're pinning their hopes on perestroika, giving them financial independence, an incentive to improve production. At present, the Ministry of Metals takes 83% of the steelworks' turnover. The combinat reports directly to Moscow, and the local management has few incentives to safeguard the town's health. Not only does the central ministry take most of the steelworks' profits, it also pays any fines levied on the plant for polluting the air or water. So this industry can afford to, and often does, ignore the law. People here say that often at night, such filters as exist are often illegally switched off, so making it almost impossible to breathe. Financial independence would not only earn the steelworks money, it would also force them to pay their own fines, a powerful incentive to improving the environment.
If only we get support from on high, not just ministerial, but government approval, we can extend perestroika and improve our plant. We'll be able to earn money for our own capital investment. We don't want to ask anybody for anything. We want to earn funds for modernization ourselves, so we can raise pay and solve social problems.
Magnitogorsk has made its contribution to the nation and its defense. Now the young generation, born in the shadow of the combinat, believes the nation should repay its debt to Magnitogorsk. It may be part of a system they now reject, as they reject their poisoned environment. But to abandon Magnitogorsk is unthinkable.
The combinat is a museum, a monster devouring itself, producing for the sake of production, not for people. But now we demand, above everything else, the right to lead a normal human life.
I'm convinced a clean environment also costs money, and it'll cost more and more. But is it necessary to have more and more energy? What limits are there? Do we need more and more industry? I don't want to stop progress, but maybe it's time to think again.
Across the Soviet Union, people are looking at the results of half a century of industrial progress and deciding the human and ecological costs are too great. But setting limits on progress to save the environment and at the same time satisfying the workers' aspirations for a better life is the colossal task facing Perestroika and Mr. Gorbachev.
And steps towards disarmament and balanced troop reductions met with success. But once again, events surrounding the Suez Canal created another test of wills within NATO. In October 1973, Soviet-backed Egypt launched a surprise attack on American-backed Israel. When the U.S. rushed to supply Israel with military aid, they were denied access to the airspace and territories of their European allies. Europe's lack of cooperation reflected its dependence on Arab oil, but by protecting itself in limiting U.S. assistance to Israel and not recognizing the Soviet threat, Europe's NATO leaders were once again taking a dangerously narrow view.
Brezhnev sent a very tough message indicating that in the event we did not agree to go in together with him, he unilaterally was going to send forces into the area to impose peace on Israel, of course. Under those circumstances, we had to react. We did it in two ways. One, we sent a message in which we indicated to Brezhnev that in the event that he did take unilateral action, that it would jeopardize our détente relationship and probably totally destroy it. And then we took an action which we thought would emphasize those words by calling an alert of our forces, which included nuclear forces. Now there, we did not suggest to him, we did not threaten to him or to his ambassador that in the event that they moved in unilaterally, we would bomb Moscow. But on the other hand, it was implicit that in the event that they did move in, we would have to react. And under the circumstances, if we did react, you always had to consider that it might go to the ultimate weapon.
But the Soviets backed down, and a nuclear confrontation was averted. U.S. relations with both the Soviets and the NATO allies were strained. But more alarming was the discovery that the promise of détente was also fading. As the superpowers were engaged in political détente, the Soviets took advantage of military détente. While the U.S. and NATO slowed their military spending since 1971, the Soviets increased military spending. They had also continually upgraded weapons and training of Warsaw Pact troops to the point of creating a serious imbalance with NATO forces. Most disturbing, though, was the deployment of new Soviet SS-20 medium-range missiles targeted at every major NATO military installation and capital. In 1978, U.S. President Jimmy Carter felt compelled to request for NATO over 500 intermediate-range missiles throughout Europe. By the spring of 1979, in the hope of averting deployment of those weapons, President Carter and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev signed the SALT II agreement in Vienna.
I believed then, and I believe now, that SALT II was a major achievement and a necessary next step toward a much more comprehensive SALT agreement, which we would have called SALT III, that would have included the intermediate range missiles and also a much more drastic reduction in overall nuclear weaponry.
But at the end of 1979, a hostile U.S. Congress refused to ratify the SALT II treaty. The 70s brought NATO full circle. For almost 20 years, Europe wanted control of its own nuclear destiny and was about to receive its payday. But with no SALT treaty and an enormous proliferation in nuclear weapons by both alliances, NATO would have to be deadly careful of what it wanted. The Eagle and the Bear will return in a moment.
Great hearing. Right, RC.
In 1981, with the arms race soaring and the recognition that Moscow had taken military advantage of détente, new U.S. President Ronald Reagan took an extremely tough stand against the Soviets.
We've seen it intensifying during the last 10 years as the Soviet Union and its surrogates moved to establish control over Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Angola.
President Reagan's vision of the Soviets' evil empire alienated Moscow and seriously concerned Europe's NATO allies. But with NATO intermediate-range missiles soon planned for deployment in Europe, the Soviets sat down with the U.S. in Geneva in 1982 to try and work out an intermediate nuclear force, or INF, agreement. In early 1983, President Reagan outlined the 0-0 plan as an option to deployment.
Together with our NATO allies, we decided in 1979 to deploy new weapons beginning this year as a deterrent to their SS-20s and as an incentive to the Soviet Union to meet us in serious arms control negotiations. We will begin that deployment late this year. At the same time, however, we're willing to cancel our program if the Soviets will dismantle theirs.
But the Soviets wouldn't budge. When the first INF missiles arrived in Europe toward the end of 1983, the Soviets walked out of the Geneva meetings and cut off all military negotiations with NATO and the US. And to further complicate matters, a new generation of young Europeans vehemently opposed NATO's deployment of the INF missiles. President Reagan further fueled the arms race with his Strategic Defense Initiative, a space-based defense system designed to destroy Soviet nuclear missiles in flight. SDI was the ultimate representation of Cold War technology. Its cost in development alone would reach into the billions. SDI staggered the Soviets. U.S. ability to destroy Soviet missiles meant a total reconsideration of the nuclear balance of power. With an already stagnant Soviet economy, it was believed Moscow could not begin to compete on even a financial level. Ironically, the economics of SDI would play a larger role than its military might in forging a new peace. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev began a course that would bring about the most dramatic changes in Europe since World War II. He began restructuring and democratizing the Soviet system in hopes of reviving a devastated Soviet economy. Waging peace was much less expensive than waging war. Dramatically, Gorbachev declared that Warsaw Pact forces would no longer be available for the suppression of national uprising. And if there were any doubts about Gorbachev's sincerity, they were certainly put aside when he and President Reagan signed the newly negotiated INF Missile Treaty in 1987, based on the 0-0 proposal. It was the first superpower treaty in history to actually reduce and not merely limit nuclear weapons. Though the treaty was highly coveted by NATO, Western Europe worried as its nuclear deterrent was stripped away. But if NATO's mandate in 1949 was to contain the communist threat, then events exactly 40 years later served to justify its often fragile unity. Throughout 1989, the Warsaw Pact nations overthrew their communist governments, and Gorbachev remained true to his word. The Soviets did not interfere.
This year, the people of the East made fundamental choices about their destiny, and governments there began to honor the citizens' right to choose. What these changes amount to is nothing less than a peaceful revolution. And the task before us, therefore, is to consolidate the fruits of this peaceful revolution and provide the architecture for continued peaceful change, to end the division of Europe and of Germany, to make Europe whole and free.
The outbreak of peace had already brought about dramatic changes in NATO and the Warsaw Pact. But NATO had already endured 40 years of tumultuous change. So as the continent of Europe became reacquainted, NATO would continue to evolve in the search for a new relationship between the eagle and the bear.
Someday, underwater plant and animal life struggle to survive in a threatened environment on Challenge of the Seas. Now stay tuned for The Importance of Being Earnest, next on A&E.